Welcome to Cold Steel, the Canadian Journal of Surgery podcast, with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball. The goal of the CJS podcast is threefold. The first is to highlight the best research currently being completed by Canadian surgeons. The second is to offer educational topics for both surgeons and trainees alike. And most importantly, the third goal is to inspire discussion, thoughts, creativity, and career development in all Canadian surgeons. We hope you enjoy it. This is a very special episode of Cold Steel. The murder of George Floyd is yet another example in a very long list of visually disturbing interactions between visible minorities and authority figures in America. While heartbreaking in its own right, this event, and the subsequent global social ignition that has followed, has prompted a broader discussion on racial equity across society. This conversation is equally important within medicine, and in particular surgery. We are lucky enough today to be joined by three guests. Morad Hameed and Shahzeer Karmali are friends of the podcast and known to many of you. But we also have Dr. Julius Ebinu, who himself has an amazing story of migration as a teenager from Swaziland, Africa to Canada, has completed a PhD at the University of Alberta, a postdoc degree at Harvard University, and who has worked both previously in New York City as a neurosurgeon and currently in Sacramento, California. The panel's comments and call for change are food for thought for all of us at a very deep level. Well, welcome to a very special edition of Cold Steel, the surgical podcast. We thought, given the intensity and the magnitude of recent events, not only in the United States and Canada, but really throughout the world, that we should probably address it and have a conversation. So we're very lucky to have really four great guests, including Amir, who of course you as listeners all know. And our goal today was to talk and explore the concept of racial equity, and in particular how that impacts surgery, not only in Canada, but also in the US. So maybe with that in mind then, Dr. Ebinu, we're hoping that maybe you could give us your general thoughts on racial diversity within surgery as a whole, and in particular for our listeners, as somebody who, spent the first part of your life in Swaziland and then moving to Canada and now working in the US as a neurosurgeon.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Ball. It's obviously great to be on here and to have this discussion, especially in light of what's going on in our world today, more so here in the United States. I think as far as race goes, it's safe to say that throughout Canada and also throughout the United States, there's steadily becoming an increase in the diversity of the population as a whole. And as far as healthcare goes, it's important when one considers healthcare delivery and healthcare disparities or equity, as it were, to ensure that that same diversity is reflected within the healthcare workforce. And I've had the privilege of training in Canada and then working in the United States on the East Coast, New York City, and now on the West Coast in Sacramento. And it's been very interesting to me to see how there is diversity or lack thereof, both within the healthcare workforce, within the trainees that are within the system, and also as far as the disparities within the healthcare delivery to the patients that we see. So I think it's an important topic to talk about. I think here in the United States, they have at least acknowledged that it is a problem, and that disparity is more apparent with the pandemic that's going on right now. So understanding that it is a problem, acknowledging that it is a problem, and then sort of working towards some of the potential solutions to address it are all important within surgery and within healthcare as a whole.
Curious, Julius, how has the pandemic informed or impacted this greater conversation on racial diversity specifically?
Yeah. So, what we're noticing here in the United States is that more so the minority population, those of color or other minority ethnic groups, tend to be more affected as far as contracting the virus and either being hospitalized and dying. And the question has become, why is it that despite the percentage population of minorities within a certain city, why is there a disproportionately higher amount of minorities being affected? And I think it really boils down to some of the systemic issues here within the United States as far as the healthcare system goes, and more so how healthcare is viewed and practiced in the United States. And what do I mean by that? Well, by and large, as opposed to in Canada, healthcare is not accessible to all here in the United States. There are certain barriers that exist, and healthcare is, for the most part, considered a privilege, right? So the higher socioeconomic status you have, the more access you have, the more privileges you have as far as your health is concerned. And that's both in terms of preventive measures as well as, treatment or surgical interventions. And so with this whole pandemic, what they're realizing is those population groups that have not had that consistent access for reasons such as their socioeconomic status tend to be disproportionately affected by the virus. And I think it's highlighting some of the inequities in the system as a whole, more so as it pertains to access to healthcare and implementing some of the preventive measures that would render certain populations, put them in a better place to be resilient towards fighting this virus.
It's really interesting. Shaz, in Canada, both at the Canadian Surgery Forum level as well as the Canadian Association of General Surgeons, you've been a very vocal proponent, and I know it's certainly a passion of yours with regard to the concept of racial equity. And, I've always sort of thought from afar that you've balanced that very nice with gender equity, most recently in the last couple of years. How do you view this sort of whole topic from a Canadian perspective? And just for the listeners to know, Shahzeer did spend a little bit of time in Houston training, doing bariatrics, so it does have that American flavor as well.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting topic, Chad. So, when we look at Canada as a general, when you compare Canada to US, Canada's usually, seen as a very diverse and multicultural population. There's always this idea of, I'm obviously a visual minority. So the difference between Canada and the US is this idea that, Canada bows this idea of multiculturalism, whereas in the US, it's this idea of a melting pot, right? In the US, you all melt and you're US first, right? Whereas Canada, I'm an Indo-Canadian, right? Like, so it's this different idea. So generally, Canada is seen as this kind of multicultural, diverse population. But when you kind of dig into it a little bit more and you look at medicine in general, and is there diversity really in medicine? And there's a really good article published in the CMAJ, and this is kind of where some of the interest comes about by a person actually that a lot of us know as Moniza Walji. So she published this idea on diversity in medical education, and it delved into this idea as, is there diversity truly in the medical system? And interestingly, I as an academic, I'm involved in medical school interviews and stuff like that. And interestingly, like, diversity isn't really a question that's asked. We don't really ask students who apply, what racial background are you? I guess it could be taken in either way. And the interesting thing is, so they looked at their studies and what she did is they published the idea of, like, how diverse is medical education. I'll just kind of quote a couple things that she quoted. So, our Canadian data, we look at diverse minority groups. And so minority groups like what I and Amir represent, and Morad, South, Southeast, and East Asians, they're actually really well represented in medical schools. They tend to be, within 30 to 40% of medical school classes. But there are other groups that are very underrepresented. And specifically, when we look at Aboriginal groups, like, they are ranking around 1.6%. And when you jump towards, individuals who identify themselves as African or Caribbean, it drops to, 2 to 4%. So it's very interesting when we look at diversity in Canada. And this is kind of where my take on what was looking at my association, the Canadian Association of General Surgeons, the idea that, we may see ourselves as diverse and welcoming, but I don't think we're as diverse as we think we are, and we have a lot of ways to go in terms of ensuring that a lot of groups are included in this idea of diversity, even if, you know, there's a lot of Southeast Asians or Asians included. Does that mean just because we're there that we're being diverse to other minority groups? And so that's kind of my take on it and my idea. And this is why I've been kind of proposing the idea of global diversity, make sure all groups are included in this diverse concept.
Yeah, that's very well said, Shaz. You've really been a champion of that nationally in the last few years, and you know, all of us can't thank you enough. Morad, Dr. Hameed, if we come over to you, I'm curious how you frame and how you process the concept of racial diversity within surgery, and in particular, although I think we'll get into it a little bit later, with your leadership position as the section head of general surgery and at a big institution like UBC, how does that inform and impact how you think of it and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Chad. For me, growing up in Edmonton in the 70s and 80s, I was very conscious of race and of racism, and I expected to encounter it when I started my medical school and surgical residency. But surprisingly, my personal experience has been very positive. I've never personally encountered racism to my knowledge, and my colleagues have always been a diverse group with very positive interactions. And I guess this follows up on what I understood Shaz to say just now, which is that there is some apparent diversity in the surgical workforce, but maybe it's not uniform, and maybe we still have a long way to go before we achieve true equity and diversity in the workforce. But at a high level, for me personally, my experience has been good, and I've always felt welcomed by my mentors and by my colleagues and by my patients. So I think that that lens of being aware of race also transcends to our patient experiences, and our research groups have done a lot of work on the social determinants of health and thinking about race, and Shaz and Chad, you've been involved in many of those studies, and we see we know that this problem exists because we see it in access to healthcare and in the outcomes of healthcare among our patients. So I guess in summary, my personal experience in healthcare has been good. I know that we have a long way to go. I would love to tell you what approach we're taking with the Division of General Surgery at UBC. And from the perspective of our patients, our studies have joined a great body of literature in the world that shows that there's a tremendous disparity based on the social determinants of health that remain to be explored further.
Julius, if we come back to you, I realize this is a hard question, and I appreciate your thoughts, but in particular, having been in the U.S. for a while, and then as we mentioned, growing up in Canada for a large part of your youth, within medicine anyway, what are some of the potential struggles that you've had with regard to racial equity? I mean, my observation of you over a very long period of time is that you handle everything with, grace and elegance and humor, but I can't imagine that you would have skated through all of these different environments that you've been through without having some issues here and there along the way.
I think a lot of how I have handled or dealt with sort of racial biases has been sort of from my upbringing. And I'll just give you a little background for those of you that don't know. I was in a boarding school at a young age in Swaziland, and it was a boarding school that was set up with the premise of promoting international tolerism as far as cultures go. They're called the United World Colleges, which they're all over the world. They have satellite locations, and at the time I was there, it was the same time when Nelson Mandela was in prison. So Swaziland, basically, for those who don't know, is a landlocked country, and it's surrounded by South Africa. And at the time, whenever we would go to South Africa, We would go to places where you would see signs that would say whites only, coloreds, which were the mixed races, and then blacks, right? So the impact of that was tremendous, but not so much from the perspective of me feeling like my race was inferior, but more so from the perspective of being at this school where we had various races that actually respected me as an individual and looked beyond my skin color. So I think that early exposure and an understanding that there are people that would have certain opinions as far as who I am, and those specific opinions may not necessarily be universal to other people, and I think I learned that at a young age. Having said that, yes, I've lived, growing in Canada and as well as here in the United States, and I will say, as far as racism, as far as racial bias, I think for the most part in Canada it is prevalent. It's subtle, right? It's very subtle, and you sort of see it as you sort of live your daily life. And just to give you a random example, I've had many occasions where you'd go to a store and for whatever reason, you'll notice someone following you around the store, right? And it's not like you're the only person in the store, but you're aware of those little sort of subtleties where you feel like you're being singled out because of your race. As far as the educational system goes in Canada, one of the norms for me going through the system was pretty much being, one of the only Black people within my class or within a given group, right? And within Canada, you sort of, because it's so diverse as a whole, the impact of that isn't as great. But I think when you come across over to the United States, the impact of that becomes more relevant. And what I mean by that is I think there's systemic perceptions, biases when it comes to race here in the United States, and it's deeply rooted within this country. Going back to the slave trade, and I think part of the challenge here in the United States has been changing that sort of systemic perception of different races and the stereotypes that are out there, where if you see a certain person of a certain race, there's this automatic assumption that they're either up to no good or they can't excel at one thing or the other, right? So I've had quite a few. I've had quite a few experiences with regard to racism, and my first encounter here in the United States when I was in Boston for my postdoc. I took the opportunity to walk around, Harvard and whatnot, and obviously dressed like everyone else. There wasn't really anything unique about how I looked, and I remember this, distinctly. So I decided to go check out the labs within the medical school, and there's always a security guard at the door, so I walk in, and automatically the security guard says to me, he goes, "Oh, you must be here to come and fix our plumbing, right?" And
Wow.
And I was a little taken aback by that statement, immediately I was a bit surprised actually at that statement. And I said to him, I said, "How did you guess?" And he said, "Well, there's not a lot of people like you around here, right? As in within that work here in this facility." And I said, "Wow." I said, "Fair enough." So I said, "Actually, no. And I had my all my papers as far as registration and whatnot, and the fact that I was there as a student." And I said, "No, actually, I'm actually here to take a look at the lab because I'm one of the postdocs here." And you should have seen the look on his face. But I think for me, the most striking aspect of that was the immediate assumption, right? And that assumption was based on the fact that even within that building as a whole, there were not a lot of professionals or students or researchers that looked like me, and that were there. And so in his mind, the immediate perception was that I was there to do some job that he would typically see someone of my color doing. And so that was a harsh and rude awakening to racism and race relations here in the United States. And I think throughout the training, you do experience it with some patients. At the end of the day, I think my goal is to, as we all swore, first do no harm. And I think as long as we impart that understanding to our patients, then you just sort of you choose to ignore the other aspect of their perception of you as a given race, right? As a Black physician. So I will say, the stereotype here in the United States is really strong, and it's not so much even amongst those that may be primarily white, but even amongst Black people, because within a hospital setting, you'll see patients who happen to be Black as well, and they do comment on how proud they are to see someone like me doing what I'm doing, right? And that to me is, obviously I'm very appreciative of the statements, but it's also very disturbing to hear that, because you ask yourself, why is that such a tremendous feat for someone of color within this system, right? Why is it that people are shocked or amazed to see someone like myself in a certain position? And so I think it just lends itself to some of the institutional racism that is here, the prejudices and the stereotypes that seem to be out there. And a lot of it is also promoted by some of the social media as a whole. So yeah, I've had my encounters, but by and large, I think I had a good foundation as a child and early exposure to knowing that there are good aspects of human beings, and there are bad aspects of human beings. And I think if you choose to view it as such and to recognize that not everyone thinks along the same lines, and I think you're one step ahead of everyone else.
It is impossible to talk about this topic, as you mentioned, without talking about the role of social media and all of this. If you haven't been living under a rock for the last 2 weeks, you know about what's been going on with the Black Lives Matter protests, what happened with George Floyd. And I think a big part of that has been social media and the role that's played both in the protests and in the response to that. And one of the things that I've often thought about and really struggled with is this whole idea of where do physicians fit in terms of advocacy on social media. So I sent you guys all the link to a paper that was done by Langenfeld and others that actually looked at social media usage among surgeons and surgical residents. And what they were trying to do in the study is identify any unprofessional uses of social media, and they found quite a lot. But one of the interesting things that I noticed up front about that paper and other papers like it is that they actually label as one of their criteria for being unprofessional as espousing a particular political opinion or having very strong political leanings. And I've always really struggled with that, because I think on one hand, it is impossible for me as a physician who cares about the health of my patients on a broad level to not speak out on something that I think is dramatically and tangibly impacting their health. And I think racism in the US and in Canada does play a huge role in affecting parts of our population and affecting the lives of Black people in the United States. And then on the flip side, I really struggle with this idea of being a professional, and I wonder how a patient would feel in terms of if they knew that I had a particularly strong political leaning. And so maybe I'll turn to Dr. Hameed, especially in your role in the UBC. Where do you see physicians straddling or navigating that role as physicians who are impartial but also care about their patients on social media?
Amir, I was afraid that you were going to ask me this question. As someone who's maybe tweeted like 3 times in his life, I've been slow to use social media. Interestingly, in the last few weeks, I have relied on Twitter to find all the articles that have been coming out about structural racism. And I've been following some of the tweets of the surgeons who are most active in this area to try to gauge the way people are processing everything. I think social media has tremendous use in that way to kind of democratize information and to, I guess, in some ways, amplify injustices so that they can be seen by everybody. And so, in that sense, I've actually, coincident with COVID-19 and with these George Floyd related protests, I've relied more on social media than I ever have before. It's been useful to me just to follow these movements. I also noticed that in the traditional media, which is increasingly polarized, that small incidents can be can also be amplified, sometimes just to increase traffic. And so I think it's important to bring a lot of objectivity to what we're seeing in both in social media and conventional media, because I think the line between those two things is getting a little bit blurry. But I think if we navigate this in a sober way, I think we can stand to get a lot of information. And I think that emerging social movements have a lot more power than they did before, which I think is really good news for all of us who are working in this area.
Dr. Karmali, maybe I'll ask you: do you think it's unprofessional? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's something that I struggle with, and as someone who uses Twitter a lot, do you think it's unprofessional for, let's say, a surgeon or a surgical resident to overtly come out and support a particular political leaning?
Well, I guess it depends on how you do it and where you do it. So I know, I'm pretty active in social media, so I know on Instagram and Facebook there's a group called White Coats for Black Lives Matter, and it's a strong group. So it's primarily doctors who stand up and are doing their best to convey the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very important right now. So again, that's an important political platform. I guess it depends on your take. I have friends who are on social media and they post on their own personal accounts, and some are very, very vocal, but I guess it depends on where you're posting and how you're posting. If you're posting as a physician representing a certain group, I think you have to be cognizant of what you're posting. Whereas if you're an individual, you have the right to free speech. As long as you're not doing it within your workplace or doing it in a capacity where you may be impacting other people or impacting, at least in the healthcare setting, your patients, then I think you're pretty free to speak as you wish, realizing that you have to be careful with what you say, because it can impact you both personally as well as professionally. So in the end, it comes to that dichotomy of, free speech versus, impacting what your career is, right? So I think it's a happy balance, and we have to all decide what's more important in terms of that balance, right? And if you feel that what you need to say is, regardless of what you say is what you want to convey, then you have to make that decision for yourself, right?
Dr. Ebinu, I think you're perhaps more directly affected by what's going on in the U.S. than any of us. What's your take on the huge, discussion that's going on Twitter? And I'll put the link for this in the show notes as well. But one of the things that I found particularly powerful was the hashtag Black in the Ivory, where people talked about their experiences being Black, very, very similar to what you described while in academia or in medicine, etc. What are your thoughts on this very challenging topic, particularly, I think, if you're a trainee?
Yeah, so I guess the question pertains to being Black in a predominantly non-Black environment as far as the education system goes. I think, I think that the challenge is one, recognizing that and not having that affect how you perceive yourself. What do I mean by that? Well, within this society here in the United States, the overall perception when it comes to minorities and people of color is is the suggestion that they may not be as intellectual as others, right? And so you have yourself in this scenario where you're the only person of a given color in an environment that already has this stereotype of your abilities and capabilities. And so I think for those that don't have a solid ground or foundation as far as who they are as an individual and what they're about and what they represent as far as their capabilities, that can be a struggle because there will be a lot of challenges throughout the training program. And in as much as we talk about free speech and that free speech hopefully would be supportive of a more acceptable environment, there are those that don't have that same mindset. And so navigating that is challenging. And I'll give you an example, and this is actually just recent. We had a one trainee come in from a different transfer, actually 2 years ago, from a different institution where they went through a lot of hardships, in as much as not being given the opportunity to operate and just being made to feel insecure about their capabilities. And so it got to the point where they left the program, and we accepted them, and there was a little hesitation up front because someone's leaving another program, you wonder what actually happened. But the reality was, and I had a conversation with him before he even started, and I said, part of the challenge is one, proving to yourself what you're capable of, but the other is just proving to other people. And I said, when it comes to training, the perception of who you are as an individual or trainee should not be dictated by those that criticize you because what you feel are racial biases. In other words, know what you're capable of, work hard, and the rest will follow suit. And he did an amazing job. Why? Because he was given a lot more opportunity, a lot more independence, and a lot of it had to do with giving him the confidence within himself surgically. And he flourished. I mean, he just he's a bright kid, but he flourished, and graduated, with great recommendations and so forth. So I think within a system, one has to acknowledge that yes, there are biases, and I think it's more important to work on yourself as that unique race, realizing that whatever stereotype is out there, your goal is not to prove anyone wrong, but to better yourself, both as an individual and as a physician, because undoubtedly you will encounter scenarios where you're treated a certain way because of that. And this is not just here in the United States, but it's also in Canada. And the hardest thing is day after day after day dealing with that whole concept of maybe I am not as good as I think I am. Maybe I'm inferior to those that are around me, which can really take its toll on anyone going through a program, right? It's stressful enough being a trainee, but throw that into it, and it becomes that much more stressful.
That's very well said, Julius. There's no doubt. Morad, if I was to ask you, how do microaggressions play into this, maybe in the Canadian context? Because as you and I have discussed before, and as really Julius and Shaz have both pointed out here, I would argue that, again, as being very cautious as the middle-aged white male in this conversation, that overt, almost aggressive racism, at least in my experience and observation, it is much less common in Canada, but probably the way that we end up manifesting that is through microaggressions. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Microaggressions was a bit of a new idea for me, and I didn't. It took me a while to understand how they might have affected me. Maybe I'll tell you a story. I was a visiting professor at a university, not in Canada or the US. And I was waiting to be introduced to the head of the Department of Surgery. And I was in this oak paneled office waiting for him to come out. And the pictures on the wall, the portraits were of all the previous chairs of surgical departments. And they were all old white men. And so I looked with interest and, tried to imagine how their lives were in each decade that they were chairs. But I was a little bit nervous and I didn't quite feel at ease. And when the chair came out finally to meet me, he was about maybe 5'6" and an Indian guy. And he was like super cheerful and, and he said, well, come on in, how are you doing? And I realized that a little bit of sense of relief at that moment. And I thought, that sense that you may not belong in a room, I guess, is how microaggressions make you feel. And, those microaggressions may not even be intended. But I've been very influenced by Daniel Coyle's book, The Culture Code, about how to build cultures that promote imagination and risk and success. And one of the key elements of a successful culture, according to Daniel Coyle, is belonging, like to address that fundamental human need to belong. And even if there are subtle cues that you don't belong, I think it detracts from a culture, and all of us bear the cost of that limitation of culture. We all need everybody. We need input from all diverse perspectives to have the best organizations that we can. And I think that those microaggressions, whether intended or not, can totally derail entire cultures.
I couldn't agree more, Morad. In particular, Coyle's book, it teaches us so much about so many things. But I always sort of took that book as exactly what you said. But the other half is creating, and they go hand in hand. But the other half is creating a safe environment where you feel, like you say, welcomed, and that you're able to share and be honest with those around you. And certainly in healthcare, with the traditional, hierarchical model, there's been examples where that's not been the case. And when you look at some of these experiences, whether it's James Kerr's legacy book about the All Blacks, that's probably the single greatest and most sustainable team concept, being their rugby team in New Zealand, really these same sort of concepts of eliminating microaggressions, providing a safe environment where honesty and openness and conversation can happen, really equate to long-term success, and do, to be honest, have to be revisited over time as well, because even with the best intentions, these things get stagnant.
There's somebody talking me about, which is Scott Page, the economist, who talks about diversity and complexity. And I was struck by that example. He talks about diversity in organizations, and he says that a lot of us think that having a diverse organization is a moral imperative, like it's nice to have in a progressive society. But he argues that it's not just a nice to have. It's like it. And he goes on to do this mathematical derivation that team actually outcomes when it tackles complex problems than a more homogeneous team. And I think he used the example of if you take the top 10 students from a 200 student business class, and you can pick those top 10 by any criteria that you want. And then you take a random sample of 10 people from that same class. It's the random sample that will almost always outperform for complex tasks, simply because they bring more perspectives and they work through problems faster. So it's not just a nice to have. It's diversity is essential to have.
Shaz, maybe to you, the Annals of Surgery recently published a statement that was formal, and it prioritized rapid peer review, publishing, and then studying equity and diversity, and in particular within the surgical workforce, and their desire to have those papers submitted. And we tried to do the same thing in the Canadian Journal of Surgery in October with an editorial last year. And when we looked at it, the Canadian Journal of Surgery accepts about 50% of equity and diversity related papers, whether that's gender or racial in particular. I'm curious, as somebody who publishes a fair bit and lives in that academic world with a lot of us, what's your view on that? And do you think that the traditional peer-reviewed journal process and outlook in that way would be helpful, or is the social media world much more important?
Yeah, so the craziest thing, Chad, is like the craziest thing when you think about it right now in 2020, we're still talking about stuff like this. Like, I mean, it was just amazing looking at the news and looking at NASCAR. Like, NASCAR just took away the Confederate flag in NASCAR. Like, what is going on? Like, it's just fascinating and intriguing that we're talking in 2020 and they're in, especially in the US, they're taking down, monuments of slave owners, which they shouldn't even been up. And so it's always a question of like, what are we doing now? Like, it makes no sense, right? And so I guess tackling that question of, diversity and publications on, I guess you can publish all you want on it, but I think in the end, you publish on it and then you know how it is. A news cycle changes and something else comes about it. I think the better idea is trying to figure out what we can do to, improve things. So rather than that I think the idea is encouraging publications from diverse groups of individuals, right? So, publish on whatever concept you want to tackle on. I mean, I think we know there's lack of diversity. We know that there's microaggression. I think that's known. I think the next step is, what do we do about it? And that's why, this Black Lives Matter movement is very strong, and I hope it doesn't stop. I mean, it comes about and it goes away, and that's why I think, all groups need to link up and work with Black Lives Matter and really support this movement, because I think this movement will move forward, even if, I'm not African American by descent, but I think supporting this movement supports all of us, right? It's right now we realize that, our African American brothers are being marginalized. So as a group, we need to stand up for them. And so I think that's the take. So I guess getting back to your question, should there be a push for racial, papers talking about, diversity and racial, a racial imbalance? Sure there should be, but we know this is going on. I think the push should be figuring out how we improve things. Like, what are we doing to improve things, rather than just saying, well, it exists. Thanks for publishing my paper on it.
Certainly one of my concerns, as a middle-aged Caucasian male, surrounds the legacy or the future of this movement. And you said it so eloquently. What I, like, personally, I'm really excited about it. Like, this conversation has to happen and it has to continue, like you comment. But Julius, I'm a little bit concerned about the political or the politicization of this in the US. And it seems like the purity of the message in only 2 to 3 weeks is now being diluted into potentially many other things that certain groups, left or right, are using maybe for other less altruistic purposes. Is that an overcall on my part, or is that something you see is going on down there?
I tend to agree with you. Actually, I think that is the case. It's interesting how Shaz pointed out. There've been a lot of incidents where that whole Black Lives Matter movement has come about, but for some reason, this time things are different. And I think in the past, more often than not, the reason why things die down or so that drive or passion sort of fades away is because it becomes associated with some other aspect of either politics or what have you that really dilutes out the essence of what that means, right? And it's unfortunate, because I think here in the United States, this whole bipartisanship, as much as politics, and now how it's sort of invading, as it were, the healthcare system, religion, other aspects of our daily life, is quite disturbing. And I think until we view things in a sort of a neutral zone, without bringing and masking the essence of what we're actually trying to deal with. We're always going to have that issue, right? I think Canadians are Canadians are a bit more level-headed as far as when it comes to politics and their understanding of some of the social issues. And so, by and large, I think Canadians fully do understand, what that means as far as Black Lives Matter, and a diversity as a whole. And I hear it here a lot where people, for some reason, feel that it's diminishing the other races, which it's not. It's just acknowledging a particular race as being as relevant as the others, right? So the politics here is pretty intense, and it does dilute out the message. Unfortunately, it can cause a certain fade. But I think this time it's a little different, and we'll see how it pans out, especially with the upcoming elections in November. So.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be dramatic. I have no doubt of that. Morad, as we get closer to the end of the podcast here, and again, thank you to all of you folks for helping us better understand this as listeners. Morad, I'm curious from the leadership point of view. You run a very big program in UBC with a lot of other talented people. I'm curious how you see the concept of structural racism, maybe locally or certainly nationally, and what your thoughts are on some of the ways that we can improve, maybe collectively as well as specifically going forward.
I'm still learning a lot about this and trying to listen to figure out the right strategy to move forward. I've certainly learned tons from all of you tonight, and learning from my colleagues, and waiting to hear back from our residents and medical students about the right course to chart. And particularly, I've been influenced by one of my colleagues, Hamish Schwang, who's a general surgeon in Vernon, and he's really felt strongly that whatever we do, and I think all of these wider social movements are reminding us and empowering us to think more deeply about this and to scrutinize everything that we do, to look for evidence of structural racism that's embedded in our clinical decision making and in our resource allocation, and really to take a longitudinal approach. Like this is not a quick response, or this has to be a long-term sustained response. And I think any response has to be nuanced. It has to think about the different types of racism and bias that exist in our system, whether it's by race or culture or language, and how patients might be marginalized because of these things. And then to design culture or race or socioeconomic status specific approaches to diversity and exclusion. So I think that this has to be the standard operation of surgical divisions and departments from now on, is to always have an eye on diversity and inclusion and culture.
Shaz, what do you think we can do within Canada to continue going in the right direction here and continue to improve things?
Well, I think the main thing, Chad, is as individual people, we have to speak up about racism. I mean, there was just an article published, I think in BC, where they noticed that, there's an emergency department in BC. They were actually taking bets on Indigenous people coming into the ER and betting, having bets on who can guess their blood alcohol level. And, it's things like that really needs to be raised. And as individuals, whether you're black, brown, yellow, purple, pink, whatever you are, I think if you see, whether it's, overt racism like that, or even indirect racism, or even, microaggression, I think it's important to speak up and, mention, this is not the right way to do it, or, raise it to higher levels. That's the only way we'd be able to fix things, by working together. Like if you just rely on one group to do it, I don't think it'll work. But as a community, as a population, we have to all agree that, it's not the right thing to do. And that's why, go back to Black Lives Matter. This is where everybody supports the same movement to say that, it's not right. We all support it regardless of who we are. And I think that might be the only way we can kind of fix the inherent problem that's lasted till 2020 already, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it feels like maybe we're finally in a time where, or intentional insensitivity, or maybe even blind ignorance is finally on showcase. And that showcase is going to allow all of us, particularly those affected, to point out some of these issues, and call folks out on it when, hopefully in a productive, constructive way, but moving forward. Julius, we'd love to give the last word to you and get your thoughts on how to move forward and what we can do both in Canada and beyond.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, the first thing to do is understand and appreciate and acknowledge that diversity is important, and that diversity plays a huge role in how we function as a healthcare workforce, how we function in terms of the trainees that we have and developing our trainees, and then also in terms of addressing some of the healthcare disparities. Shaz is an example of that emergency department really lends itself to the importance of diversity. Why? Because there's an element of sensitivity to various cultures that as a physician we should be able to recognize, right? And for those of us that may have some preconceived perception of minority patients, we need to have that sensitivity to recognize that this may play a role in our ability to treat minority patients, and it may also contribute to some of the disparities in healthcare among racial and ethnic minorities. Having a diverse workforce would at least help curb some of those incidents, in as much as educating your peers as to the importance of being sensitive to various cultures. But I think on a positive note, when it comes to diversity, I also think of research, and more recently there was a successful so far experiment using a genetic modification in a patient using CRISP, the CRISPR gene for sickle cell, and it highlights the importance of not only educating people about diversity, but also implementing research that addresses diseases that may be unique to certain populations. So that as a whole emphasizes the importance all around of diversity, both in terms of the research that we do and the education that we're able to impart. I think it's unfortunate that it took that incident of this police officer and the murder of one civilian who happened to be Black, but I think as a nation, both here in the United States and in Canada, it really has increased and heightened our sensitivity to some of the racial biases that may be inherent either in the educational system or otherwise, and just as individuals asking ourselves important questions as far as race relations and how it might impact our day-to-day lives, and more so how we administer healthcare is important. So I think the future looks promising. I do think there's a long way that we have to go, but at the end of the day, I think we're going in the right direction.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you've liked what you've been listening to, please leave us a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear your comments and feedback, so feel free to email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com or connect with us on Twitter @CanJSurge. Thanks again.